Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on history, society, or our culture. But tonight we're not going to talk about people, we're going to talk about things. We're going to talk about glass, pizza, and soap. And we're going to start out tonight with Steuben Glass. The Steuben Glass Company, which made fine glassware for over 100 years, has announced it's closing down. It's closing its store in New York City, and it's closing its factory. Everybody is familiar with the fine glassware that Steuben made. It was started by a glassblower from England who came over and began working for the Corning Glass Factory. The glass pieces they developed over 100 years were beautiful. There were beautiful designs, beautiful shapes, all sorts of great ideas. The company had its ups and downs. It was sold completely to Corning in the 30s. And then about 3 years ago, it was sold to a conglomerate which didn't have glass as its main product. And eventually, the Steuben Glass Works became a non-profitable part of the conglomerate, and so they decided to shut it down. But at one point, a whole bunch of families in the United States had at least one piece of Steuben glassware in their house, and it was a source of pride for millions. Here is reporter Rob Price from PA Live with his reminiscences about Steuben Glass.
Corning Incorporated's old subsidiary, Steuben Glass, made modern glass sculptures that were favored many years ago as gifts for special occasions. The occasion had to be special because the lead crystal sculptures were very expensive. A Steuben glass ashtray could cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars. And then there was that lead crystal block with a letter opener sticking out, looking like King Arthur's sword, Excalibur, waiting for the young Arthur to pull the sword from the stone. I know that piece had to be in the four figures. It was a gift my grandfather received from his company's board of directors when he retired from his company in Pittsburgh. It was a gift for an older man by possibly even older men. It was also a gift that belonged to an age when people actually sent each other letters that you had to open with a letter opener. But mainly it was a gift that appealed to the imagination of a young boy who liked to picture himself pulling a magical sword from a magical stone. Those days are gone, and so is Steuben Glass, whose owner, the Schottenstein Corporation of Ohio, announced recently it was shutting down the business. I called my parents with the news, and my father said, "Oh no." And then I asked him, whatever happened to that Steuben glass ashtray they kept in our living room? And he said that I shot it with a BB gun. Actually, I really didn't. But Steuben glass did have a way of getting nicked when children were involved. A cousin sent me an email recently when she heard the news that the company was closing. She remembered another Steuben glass piece in our grandparents' house. It was a lead crystal trout in mid-leap with a 24-karat gold fly and fishing hook inserted in its mouth. My cousin remembered the fly was somehow lost during one of her brothers and sisters' visit to the house. That was another example of just how difficult it was to maintain Steuben glass when children were in the area. None of us remember what happened to the chipped, damaged, and even occasionally pristine pieces of Steuben glass we grew up with around our parents' home, our grandparents' houses, and it's truly a shame that that heritage, that history, is about to go by the wayside. There will be no replacing that lead crystal rock with Excalibur sticking out at a jaunty angle. And if only, as in the imagination of a young boy, Steuben Glass itself could have figured out a way of pulling its own magical sword from the stone. This is Rob Price for PA Live.
Yeah, Rob is right. You could get in a lot of trouble back in the old days if you chipped a piece of Steuben glass, but that's just one of those things we're not going to have to worry about anymore with the closing of the Steuben Glass Works. We're going to move on now to pizza. Okay, and basically everybody knows that the real existential question in life is not communism versus capitalism, paper versus plastic, Ginger versus Marianne. The real existential question is pizza, thick crust or thin crust. I'm a Chicagoan, so I go for thick crust pizza, but I have to admit that I do have a fondness for thin crust pizza, and the best thin crust pizza that you're going to get in the United States, bar none, is in New York City, in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And if you go to New York City and Manhattan, the pizza places you're going to see all over, and you've seen for the last 40, 50 years, are Ray's Pizza. And the original Ray's is closing down. Now, when I say the original Ray's, I don't mean the original Ray's, I mean the first Ray's. because as you'll see, there are many original Ray's. But the first Ray's pizza place, which would sell you a slice taken out of a steel berry oven and put on a paper plate, is closing down. As the report you're about to hear will tell you, there are a whole bunch of Ray's in Manhattan. And when I used to go to Manhattan a lot in the 1970s, my favorite was on, I believe it was 76th or 77th on 3rd. The pizza was great. It was $1. It was a meal in and of itself. I've noticed that, as with thick crust pizza in Chicago today, the pizzas become homogenized for more and more tastes. It doesn't have the taste that it used to have. So the thick crust, thin crust debate is to a certain extent moot today, because in both situations it's been homogenized, but the first Ray's Pizza is closing down. Here's a Manhattan tour guide to tell you about Ray's Pizza with his characteristic New York understatement.
Probably the most important information you'll ever get in your life. Okay? Actually, we're talking about the most misunderstood pizzeria in the world. And there's one standing right across from us called Ray's. There are currently about 35, 40 pizzerias with the name Ray somewhere in the title in New York City alone. And they all claim to be the original Ray. Here's one. You see the crown up there? It's the king, right? Well, Ray in Italian means king. And it says famous original Ray's Pizza, established 1964. Okay? Great. Wonderful. This is the famous original. You go there for lunch all the time. All of them were established in 1964. Not true. The logo was established in 1964. Because of all these places, other Rays are sprouting up across town that also claim to be original and famous, but in different ways. It's called the one and only famous Rays of Greenwich Village. So it says famous, just like all these guys, but instead of original, now this one says one and only. This one's called the Bagel Cafe Ray's Pizza. But if Manhattan has all these Ray's pizzas, then of course Brooklyn is going to fight back with not Ray's Pizza. See this guy with Ray Charles with an X through his face? There's a famous original Ray's, then there's an original famous Ray's, then there's original famous Ray's Pizza, and then there's original Ray's Pizza, famous Ray's Pizza, world famous Ray's Pizza, Ray Barry Pizza. It keeps on going. This is the original. Lombardi's represents really that turn of the century margarita pizza. That's the fresh tomato, the basil, and the mozzarella cheese that really mirror the colors of the Italian flag. That's the margarita pizza. This is different. This is your bigger, cheesier, greasier New York slice. And the reason why we have this is because pizza finally became popular around the time this opened. Pizza wasn't popular when Lombardi's was just starting. Now, one big difference, they're not all opening up brick oven pizzerias. Okay? That's too expensive, too difficult to have brick ovens going all over the place. So they have new pizza ovens coming out. You can kind of see in there's a gray stainless steel oven. That's called a deck oven. I say brick ovens and I'll say deck ovens. That's what I mean by deck oven. And that's the technology that came about that made pizzerias really popular. That's why, folks from Nebraska, that's why you guys have pizza. It's because these ovens are possible, you know? Follow me down the road, and I'm going to bring you into a restaurant supply store that sells the exact oven that they use inside Ray's. And we're going to stick our heads in there and see how it works. Follow me.
So Ray's Pizza, which was actually opened by a guy named Ralph Cuomo in the late 50s on Prince Street in Little Italy, is closing down. But don't worry, there are still plenty of Ray's left in New York City, and if you enjoy thin crust, try one out. If you enjoy thick crust, come to Chicago. We're going to close tonight with soap. Well, not soap, but soap operas. One of the longest running soap operas in television, All My Children, is closing after 40 years. All My Children started in 1970. It was created by a lady named Agnes Nixon. Agnes Nixon was a nice girl from Chicago, from Northwestern University, and she worked on a number of soap operas in the late 50s and 60s. Because a friend of hers had died of cancer, she wanted to inject a more realistic feeling into soap operas. She created One Life to Live, which was sort of the prototype for All My Children. She tried to sell All My Children to both NBC and CBS, who turned it down. But in 1970, ABC, which was the third network, picked up All My Children, and All My Children turned out to run for 40 years. And it was indeed the first soap opera which dealt realistically with some of the problems of the time. It dealt with Vietnam, it dealt with women's rights, It dealt with abortion. It dealt with racial issues. It was the first soap opera that wasn't just a bunch of wasps. So it was the, quote, realistic soap opera. In the late 1970s, it was the #1 rated soap opera in the United States during daytime television. In the 1980s, it dropped to #2, and when it was canceled recently, it had pretty much fallen to the bottom of the ratings, as all soap operas eventually do. But for many years, it was a big deal. The title All My Children comes from a poem that's in the title credits photo album that was written by Agnes Nixon. The great and the least, the rich and the poor, the weak and the strong, in sickness and in health, in joy and sorrow, in tragedy and triumph, you are all my children. It took place in the fictional village of Pine Valley, which was a suburb of Philadelphia, and there were actually some big-time stars on that show. One of the stars of the show was Ruth Warrick. Ruth was originally part of Orson Welles' troupe in the 40s. She played Charles Foster Kane's first wife in Citizen Kane. There was Karen Lynn Gorney, who played Stephanie Mangano, who was John Travolta's girlfriend in Saturday Night Fever. Christian Slater had a turn for a year on the show. And of course, there was Susan Lucci, who went year after year after year and never won an Emmy Award until she finally won one a couple of years ago. Let's just leave it at Susan's been on the show for a long time, and, well, it looks like, I don't know, maybe she's had some work done. Carol Burnett loved the show and did a brief turn on the show, as did Elizabeth Taylor. And Agnes Nixon was actually on and played a character whose name was Agnes Eckhart, which was her maiden name. When your soap opera runs 40 years, you've got a lot of characters on the show, believe me. Here's a brief snip from an early episode of All My Children.
What kind of a monster are you?
I am a flesh and blood man, Amy, just as you're a flesh and blood woman. A woman who loved me very much once.
Don't touch me, Nick.
Amy, I never stopped loving you.
Well, you never even knew what the word meant.
Oh, yes, I do, Amy.
I
Yes.
told you to stay away from me.
Why don't you want me to touch you, Amy? You afraid of the feelings it might stir up?
No.
Well, come on. Why don't you admit it?
Nick, please. It's Link.
Oh, how convenient. I've been looking forward to a chance to talk to your husband.
Mom, did you know Nick Davis will be at the prom tonight?
Nick Davis, why?
He's a chaperone. Hey, why do you have to get so uptight about him?
I'm not uptight.
Yes, you are. You almost act as if you're afraid of him. Why, Mom? What could he do to you?
Nothing, darling. Nothing at all.
Watch All My Children weekdays at 1, 12 Central Time on ABC.
Yeah, a lot of people watched All My Children for a long time. It was also very popular with men for a while, go figure. Well, that's it for tonight. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close with the theme from All My Children. But it's not the theme as the way you heard it if you did watch the show. As I mentioned before, Agnes Nixon tried to sell the show to CBS in the late 60s. CBS at that time was the Tiffany network. It was the most popular network with the most money. And they considered picking up the show, and they actually did the theme song for All My Children. But in the CBS soap operas, they used lush orchestras, and they always used organs for some reason. I don't know why. That was characteristic of CBS soap operas. They always used organ music. Maybe they wanted to think you were in church or something. I don't know. So here is the All My Children theme, not as you heard it on low-budget ABC, but as you would have heard on the Tiffany network of Bill Paley. Here's what the All My Children close would have sounded like on CBS.